Speaker.
Thursday.
I wish to reassure I thank my honourable friend for his question. I wish to reassure him that the UK government is fully committed to protecting and upholding Northern Ireland's place in the Union. I regularly discuss matters of Union and the importance of Northern Ireland within it and with Cabinet colleagues, and meet frequently with the Secretary of State for Wales and Scotland.
Simon Baines.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would my right honourable friend agree that the Union is now stronger than ever, particularly with the decline of the SNP, and that its vital importance can be seen not only in Northern Ireland, but also in border constituencies like mine of Clwyd South, particularly in shared services across the border with neighbouring North Shropshire, such as the Gabowen to Wrexham line, the A5A483 and the Chirk St Martin's GP partnership. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As you can see, all politics is local, and I congratulate my honourable friend in the success of shared cross-border services in his constituency, and he's absolutely right. I know he's a great champion of connectivity across the United Kingdom, and I'm sure his constituents appreciate his efforts on these matters.
Samuel Wilson.
Speaker, every devious, deceitful and dishonest tactic is being used to try and bribe, bully and beat unionists into accepting the Windsor Framework and the Northern Ireland Protocol, despite the impact it has on our citizenship and on the Union. It seems that the latest recruit is the chairman of the Northern Ireland Affairs Committee, who only this week has told BBC that unions should get back into Stormont because constitutional issues are the responsibility of the EU, and that the Irish government in any settlement would have a say in the future of Northern Ireland. Can the Secretary of State confirm that this Conservative Unionist government has not handed constitutional control of Northern Ireland to the EU, and that the chairman of the Northern Ireland Affairs Committee has either become an overzealous advocate of the scare tactics or is talking through his hat?
See, you're as brief as ever, Secretary of State.
Well, based on that, Chair, the Select Committee Chair has a lot of work to do to increase his popularity in this House. I think, as ever, the honourable gentleman asks a question in his characteristic shrinking violet way, and I have to say I completely disagree with what he says about my right honourable friend. But we need to get a deal done now. The people of Northern Ireland want to get a deal done. It is time for a deal to be done. Let's get the executive back up and running.
Before we come to Prime Minister's questions, I'm pleased to inform the House that since last week we've been providing British Sign Language coverage on all question statements as a matter of course. This is available directly on parliamentlive.tv and is also available to broadcasters, media outlets who may be interested in taking up the live feed. I'm delighted that House Service has been able to deliver this significant improvement to accessibility of our proceedings. We now start with questions, Prime Minister. Jason McCartney.
Question 1, please, Mr. Speaker.
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, this morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others in addition to my duties in this House. I shall have further such meetings later today.
Jason McCartney.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. According to the Alzheimer's Society, nearly 5,000 people are currently living with dementia in my Colne Valley constituency, of whom 3,153 have had a formal diagnosis. That figure went up by 1 this week with my dad's diagnosis. My dad is my constituent. Will my right honourable friend pledge to make dementia a priority by driving up diagnosis rates, bolstering dementia research, investing in social care and improving access to the most innovative diagnostic methods and improving access to new life-changing treatments?
Prime Minister.
Well, can I send my warmest wishes to my honourable friend and his father and family, and I recognise that a dementia diagnosis can bring worry, both for the person who is diagnosed, but also their wider family. And my honourable friend is absolutely right about the timely diagnosis of dementia. It's vital to make sure that those affected can access the care and support they need. NHS England is actually carrying out a pilot to make sure that we can improve dementia diagnosis in care homes. Our major condition strategy also includes a focus on dementia, but crucially, as my honourable
friend said, we are now doubling the funding for dementia research so we can help everyone, including his father.
We now come to the Leader of the Opposition, Keir Starmer.
Can I send my best wishes to the honourable member and his father also, and all those suffering in this way? Mr. Speaker, I can't let today pass without saying how saddened I was by the tragic death of Bronson Battersby, aged just 2, who died in heartbreaking circumstances in Skegness. I know that this House will join me in sending our deepest sympathies to his family. Mr. Speaker, the government has been forced to admit that it has lost contact with 85% of the 5,000 people earmarked for removal to Rwanda. Has he found them yet?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, what I can tell the honourable gentleman is that in spite of him blocking every single attempt that we have taken, we have managed now, because of our actions, to reduce the number of people coming here by over 1/3 last year, remove over 20,000 people from this country back to their home countries, carried out 70% more illegal enforcement raids, arrested hundreds of people, closed down thousands of bank accounts, and processed over 100,000 cases, the biggest number in over 20 years, Mr. Speaker. That's because on this side of the House, we want to stop the boats, we have a plan, it's working, and with him, we would just go back to square one.
My first thought is, how do you actually lose 4,250 people? Then you remember that this is the government that scrapped HS2, but the costs are still rising by billions. This is the government that spent £400 million of taxpayers' money on a Rwanda scheme, yet can't deport a single person. And this is the government that waged a week-long war on the Greek Prime Minister for reasons known only to themselves. And suddenly you're reminded that, of course, this farce of a government could lose the people it was planning to remove. But he didn't answer the question, so I'll ask him again. Where are the 4,250 people that the government has lost? Where are they?
Mr. Speaker, as I said, we've actually identified and removed over 20,000 people from this country back to where they belong. But he asks these questions about the Rwanda scheme, Mr. Speaker. That it is important that we get this up and running because it's important, as the National Crime Agency say, that we have a working deterrence to resolve this issue. That's indeed how Australia solved this problem, and that's how Albania has worked for us. But we know he asked these questions, Mr. Speaker, about the detail of these things, but we all know he doesn't actually care about solving this problem, and we know this because when the BBC asked him about the Rwanda plan, they quizzed him and they said, if the numbers crossing the channel on small boats decline, i.e. so it's working, would you still reverse it? The Labour leader said yes. It's crystal clear he doesn't have a plan and it will be back to square one,
Mr. Speaker, spending £400 million on a plan not to get anybody to Rwanda whilst losing 4,000 people is not a plan. It's a farce. Only this government could waste hundreds of millions of pounds on a removals policy that doesn't remove anyone. Only this government could claim that it's going to get flights off the ground only to discover they couldn't find a plane. Only this government could sign a removal deal with Rwanda, only to end up taking people from Rwanda to here. But he still hasn't answered the question. So I'll try again. What progress has he made in locating the 4,250 people his government has apparently lost? He's dodged it 3 times. Where are they?
Mr. Speaker, it's the same thing again and again. Here we are talking about what we are doing, but I'm happy to go over it, Mr. Speaker. What are we doing? We've increased the number of illegal enforcement raids by 70%, leading to thousands of arrests, using powers, Mr. Speaker, that he blocked in this House. We have closed down thousands of bank accounts of illegal workers, again, using powers that he blocked, Mr. Speaker.
Order. Mr. do you want that early cup of tea, or are you going to be a little bit more silent, Prime Minister?
And, Mr. Speaker, as I said, we have worked through a record number of cases and returned a record number of people back to where they've come. All of that is a plan that is working, and we can see that it's working because the numbers of people coming to this country are down by over a third, Mr. Speaker. But again, it is a bit rich to hear him in here pretending that he cares about how we actually stop the boats when he's been crystal clear. He's been crystal clear and said that even if the plan is working to reduce the numbers, he would still scrap it, Mr. Speaker. It's because he has no values, no conviction and no plan. It is back to square one.
No. Yes,
He hasn't got a clue where they are, has he? I can tell you one place they aren't, and that's Rwanda. Because the only people who sent to Rwanda is cabinet ministers. And for all the word, the ridiculous thing is, we know the Prime Minister himself doesn't even believe in this Rwanda gimmick. He had to be talked out of scrapping the whole thing. He didn't want to fund it. He didn't think it would work. When he sees his party tearing itself apart, hundreds of bald men scrapping over a single broken comb, doesn't he wish he'd had the courage to stick to his guns?
Well, Mr. Speaker, now, I have absolute conviction that the plan we've put in place will work. Absolute conviction, because I believe it's important that we grip this problem. Now, he spends a lot of his time in this House talking about his time as a lawyer, Mr. Speaker, and I would urge him to listen to them, because Lord Wolfson has said that our bill severely limits the... Four eminent KCs have said that it is undoubtedly the most robust piece of immigration legislation this Parliament has seen, and Mr. Speaker, a former Supreme Court...
I want to hear what the Prime Minister's got to say, because it matters to my constituents, those who feel it doesn't matter to those. Please leave, Prime Minister.
As I said, Mr. Speaker, four eminent KCs said this is undoubtedly the most robust legislation passed, and a former Supreme Court Justice has been clear that the bill would work. But I know, Mr. Speaker, he's always been more interested in what lefty lawyers have to say, Mr. Speaker. I've even got here the textbook that he authored for them. And it's called, and I quote, European Human Rights Law by Keir Starmer. So...
Prime Minister! Prime Minister, when I stand up, please sit down. Can I just say, we don't use props in this House, and I will certainly ensure that if you do need reminding, I certainly will. Keir Starmer.
It's such utterly pathetic nonsense. He's been brutally exposed by his own MPs yet again. He's got one party chair who says she hopes the Lords will rip his Rwanda deal to pieces. He's got two more who had to quit because they don't think it'll work. All of them appointed by him, all now in open revolt against his policy, each other, and reality. Is there any wonder they all think this gimmick is doomed to failure when the Prime Minister himself doesn't believe in it?
Mr. Speaker, it is rich to hear from the honourable gentleman about belief in something, because it will be news to him. It is actually the case that you can believe in something and stick to that position on this side of the House.
I will say to this side. Oh, hello. Somebody's jumping in from over. Can I just say it's very important. It's an important day. People want to know what's going on. So I want my constituents, just like yours, to hear what the Prime Minister's got to say. Prime Minister.
Just this week, Mr. Speaker, we had another example of the honourable gentleman doing one thing, saying another, because this week he backed the Home Secretary in banning the terrorist group Hizb ut-Tahrir, despite him personally using the European Court of Human Rights to try and stop them being banned. And don't take my word for it, Mr. Speaker. The extremists' own press release said, and I quote, "the Hizb ut-Tahrir legal team led by Keir Starmer." Now, I know he doesn't like talking about them because they've been a client, but when I see a group chanting jihad on our streets, I ban them. He invoices them.
Because there's 8 questions that I think some of you may want. Well, I'll tell you what, there's some's already gone off the list who wanted them. Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, if he stuck to his position, he'd be voting with us. He'd be voting with us. His former Home Secretary says the plan won't work. His current Home Secretary calls it batshit. His former Immigration Minister doesn't back his plan. Even the Prime Minister himself doesn't believe in it. And last week, another of his MPs said the Tories should admit that things have got worse since they came to office, that after 14 years they've left Britain less united, the country is a sadder place. If the Prime Minister can't even persuade his own MPs that it's worth supporting him, if he himself doesn't even believe in his own policies, why on earth should anyone else think differently?
Mr. Speaker, another week when it's crystal clear the honourable gentleman doesn't believe in anything and he doesn't have a plan. Now, while he talks the country down, let me update him on what's actually been happening in the past week. Inflation more than halved from 11% to 4%. Real wages rising. Real wages rising for the 5th month in a row. Last week, rates started falling and millions of people benefited from a tax cut worth £450. So while he takes us back to square one with a £28 billion tax grab, let's stick with a plan that's delivering a brighter future for Britain.
Mr. Speaker, it's against the law to silence victims of crime, but that's exactly what the Post Office did through the use of non-disclosure agreements. And this is just the most recent case of NDAs covering up mismanagement, misconduct and even crimes at work. Will my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, consider banning their use in all severance agreements once and for all?
Minister.
My right honourable friend is right to raise an important point, and the ability to speak out about things is key to unlocking justice. And while NDAs can have a place, my honourable friend is right to say that they shouldn't be used to stop victims of crime, in particular getting the justice that they deserve. I can tell her that the Ministry of Justice are carefully considering how to best address this issue, including legislation, and I know that my right honourable friend, the Justice Secretary, will keep the House updated on further progress.
Leader of the SNP, Stephen Flynn.
Mr. Speaker, when people woke up today in homes that they can't afford to heat with mortgages that they're struggling to pay, to news that inflation is once again on the rise, they'll have looked to Westminster for answers. And instead they find a UK government which is tearing itself apart over how quickly it can send vulnerable people on a plane to Rwanda. Surely the Prime Minister must understand that the anger that some of his own backbenchers have towards him is no comparison to the anger that the public have towards his party.
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, if the honourable gentleman did care about supporting working families to pay their bills, to pay their mortgage, why on earth is the SNP making Scotland the highest tax part of the United Kingdom, where the average, Mr. Speaker, not the wealthiest, where the average worker in Scotland is now paying more tax than they do in England?
Stephen Flynn.
Of course, Mr. Speaker, when it comes to the Rwanda bill, the reality is that if you want to stop the smuggling gangs, you should introduce safe and legal routes. But instead, the Prime Minister is seeking to weaponise some of the most vulnerable people in society. It is straight out of the cruel and callous right-wing extremist playgroup. His time in office is fast approaching its conclusion. Does he seriously want this to be his legacy?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, as I said, it is important that we stop the boats because illegal migration is simply not fair, Mr. Speaker. It's not right that some people jump the queue that they take away our resources to help those who are the most compassionate, that need our most help, and, by the way, Mr. Speaker, are exploited by gangs, and many of them lose their lives making these dangerous crossings. So I completely disagree with the honourable gentleman. The fair and the compassionate thing to do is to break these criminal gangs, and that's why we're going to stop the boats.
Russell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Unexpectedly, 5 months ago, I had a heart attack. And thanks to the swift action of the NHS emergency services, it was caught early. So one stent operation later, I was on a swift path to rehabilitation and recovery, and stand here today, fighting fit and a bit lighter too. So along with encouraging everyone to visit the British Heart Foundation website to understand the early warning signs and get fantastic resources to help them, would the Prime Minister also join me in personally thanking everyone who helped to save my life and help me recover, including the East of England Ambulance Service, the teams at Watford General and Harefield Hospital, the cardiac rehabilitation teams, and everyone who supported me, especially my family and my team, some of whom are in the gallery today, who helped ensure that I continue to deliver for the great people of Watford.
I thank my honourable friend for sharing his story, and I know the whole House will be delighted to hear that he's made a swift recovery. We all wish him good health for the future as he resumes his excellent campaigning on behalf of his constituents in Watford. And I also join him in thanking our fantastic NHS staff for the life-saving work that they do up and down the country. We're backing them with record resources, from our doctors to our ambulance service. We are all in this House truly grateful for what they do.
Caroline Lucas.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Until the UK government calls for an immediate ceasefire, it is complicit in the horrors in Gaza. Not my words, but those of the head of Oxfam, who, like every single agency trying to operate on the ground, is clear that aid can't be effectively delivered while fighting continues. More UK aid is, of course, welcome, but even when it does get through, it can result in what one Palestinian aid worker calls bombing us on full stomachs. 24,000 people have already been killed. So can he tell us what will it take for him to back a permanent bilateral ceasefire?
Mr. Speaker, of course, we want to see a peaceful resolution to this conflict as soon as possible. A sustainable, permanent ceasefire with an end to the destruction, fighting and loss of life, release of hostages and no resumption of hostilities would of course be the best way forward. But in order to achieve that, a number of things need to happen. Hamas would have to agree to release all the hostages. Hamas would no longer have to be in charge of Gaza, and the threat of more rocket attacks from Hamas into Israel would have to end. And the Palestinian Authority, boosted with assistance, would need to return to Gaza in order to provide governance and aid. That is the sustainable ceasefire that we will work very hard to bring about.
Nick Fletcher.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, today I was unsure whether to raise a national issue, such as the desperate need for a Minister for Men, or a local issue, such as Doncaster's need for a new hospital or Edlington for a new leisure centre. But I thought the best thing I could do is ask the Prime Minister to come and have a tour of Doncaster. And while I'm showing him around my hometown, I can press the need for a Minister for Men, I can show him the site for a new hospital, and I can introduce him to the people of Edlington so he can discuss their new leisure centre. So will the Prime Minister accept my invitation?
Prime Minister.
Well, thanks to my honourable friend's fantastic campaigning on behalf of his constituents. Doncaster City Council has received, I think, more than £80 million in levelling up funding to support its regeneration products. And most recently, Doncaster has been awarded £20 million in our long-term plan for towns over the next 10 years, which I know he is working very hard to make sure is prioritised for local people. I would be delighted to discuss those projects and his other ideas when I come and visit him as soon as my diary allows.
Julie Elliott.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. 71% of requests for funding from the Community Ownership Fund aimed at saving libraries, pubs and village halls have been rejected since 2021. It pits communities against each other and does nothing to address the underlying causes that have led to the loss of these much-loved assets. When will the government offer more than a simple sticking plaster for our towns, high streets and communities.
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I set up the Community Ownership Fund when I was Chancellor, and it is doing fantastic work, funding hundreds of projects across the country, including, I believe, one in the Honourable Lady's own constituency, the Back on the Map scheme. It is there to support local communities to take over assets, whether it's pubs, village halls or other community assets, and it's doing a fantastic job. It's right that there's a competitive process because we want to make sure that that money is deployed in the areas where it can make the most difference.
Greg Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Overcrowding on Chiltern railways has become a daily misery for commuters from stations like Haddenham and Tame Parkway and Princes Risborough in my constituency, the root cause of which is an ageing fleet constantly breaking down and shorter trains having to be run. There are proposals on the table for both short-term additional capacity and long-term fleet renewals. So will my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, instruct the Department for Transport to fast-track those proposals so we can end overcrowding on Chiltern?
Prime Minister.
And I agree with my honourable friend that the performance on Chiltern hasn't been good enough in recent times. I know that Chiltern have recently begun engagement with the rolling stock leasing market, which will help reduce overcrowding, but also together with DfT, they're looking at providing additional capacity at peak times. So I know my honourable friend, the Rail Minister, will ensure that these plans continue to progress and keep my honourable friend updated.
Patrick Reddy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. What exactly is it about the prospect of deportation to Rwanda that makes the government think it will be such a deterrent to asylum seekers? Does it think that life in Rwanda is somehow less comfortable, less secure, less safe than it is here in the United Kingdom? What does the government think is wrong with Rwanda that means asylum seekers won't want to live there?
Speaker, it's not that there's anything wrong with it, it's just that it's not the United Kingdom, Mr. Speaker. And I have to point out to the honourable gentleman, deterrence works. We know that it works because our scheme with Albania has ensured a 90% reduction in arrivals from that country.
Therese Coffey.
Mr. Speaker, I know my right honourable friend the Prime Minister is committed to energy security and the development of renewables, as am I, and that's why Sizewell C started a DCO this week. However, there are plenty of other developments which are happening on greenfield sites where CPOs are planned to be used by National Grid to plough up farming fields used for food but also tree production as well, when there are brownfield sites already available connected to the network. National Grid is refusing to publish its study of Bradwell and why they deem it would not be suitable for this connection of offshore wind farms and interconnectors. Will he meet with me to discuss this and other East Anglian MPs and also to use the powers of his office to get that study published?
As my honourable friend will know, that planning applications for new infrastructure are managed independently, so I can't comment on specific cases, but I do agree with her that it's important to listen to the views of local communities like those that she represents across Suffolk and East Anglia. I know my honourable friend for Aberdeenshire West was visiting her area recently to mark the commencement of the project at Sizewell C, and I can assure her that relevant ministers will continue to pay close attention to her concerns.
Stevens.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Leader of the House last week correctly described the contaminated blood scandal as on another level compared to other scandals. Now that Sir Brian Langstaff has announced today the publication of the final report of the infected blood inquiry, he reminds us, Mr. Speaker, that his principal recommendation remains that a compensation scheme should be set up with urgency and that no one should be in any doubt about the serious nature of the failings over more than 6 decades that led to catastrophic loss of life and compounded suffering. Prime Minister, over 100 parliamentarians wrote to you this week, so can you tell us now when those affected will be paid compensation for their loss?
Mr. Speaker, I'm acutely aware of the strength of feeling on this issue and indeed the suffering of all of those impacted by this dreadful scandal. I gave evidence to the inquiry last year, and as I said then, I recognise the suffering that thousands have experienced over decades. He will know that the Minister for the Cabinet Office updated Parliament on this towards the end of last year. He'll know it's a highly complex issue. Interim payments have been made in some cases, and we are committed, absolutely committed, to responding to the final report as quickly as possible following its publication.
Robert Neal.
Mr. Speaker, last week, Conservative-controlled Bromley Council's children's services were rated outstanding by Ofsted in all 4 areas of inspection, only the 3rd time that has happened under the current framework. Will he join me in congratulating the officers and members of Bromley Council and perhaps even visit Bromley and see our new cost-saving civic centre?
Well, perhaps not quite on my way to Doncaster, but I'll bear it in mind. But can I join my right honourable friend in paying tribute to Bromley Council and all the officers involved in providing what is an incredibly important service in their local community and looking after some of the most vulnerable children in our society. They all deserve our thanks and our praise for their brilliant efforts.
Dr. Rupert.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. HS2 promised to transform intercity travel and my seat where Old Oak Common will be one day. But after Leeds and Manchester were ditched, its London end's now in doubt. Could the PM today commit to ensuring it at least reaches Euston, or is he intent on stopping all transport forms, except private jets, maybe?
Prime Minister.
I think her leader might have something to say about the forms of transportation, Mr. Speaker, and perhaps on HS2 as well, because I still haven't actually heard from him his position on the whole subject. But we have, Mr. Speaker, I would say Old Oak Common is destined to be one of the foremost stations in the country because of the stationment and the extra connectivity that it will have across London as the initial terminus for HS2 trains. And as we said at the announcement, we are working with the private sector, as we have done in other developments in London, to raise private money, save the taxpayer money, and deliver the connection to Euston as planned.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I've just got back from the inaugural Women's Health Summit. During the summit, it was announced that the specialist maternal mental health services will now be available to women in every part of England by March. This is particularly pertinent for me after one of my constituents, Jessica Cronshaw, passed away whilst pregnant with her baby Elsie after suffering with severe pregnancy sickness, hyperemesis gravidarum. So can I thank the government for following through with this important reform and push him to keep going with the spirit of this reform so our NHS is fit for women in the future?
Prime Minister.
Well, can I thank my honourable friend for raising this matter, and I know the whole House will want to convey our sympathies to Jessica's family, but I'm pleased that the reforms that we are making will make a difference to women across the country in the future. We're committed to our women's health strategy, and I'm grateful that for her support and, again, her advice and ideas so we can ensure it delivers the care that we want it to across the country.
Andrew Gwynn.
The Conservative candidate for the Wellingborough by-election yesterday revealed that the Conservative Party had offered her a deal to be the candidate if the previous member, her partner, stood down without a fuss. The Prime Minister said just last week that candidate selection is all done locally within his party. So would he now like to deny that this secret deal was offered?
Mr. Speaker, as I said last week, in our party, candidate selection is done locally.
James Gray.
Mr. Speaker, would my right honourable friend the Prime Minister agree with me that a remote rural hotel is just the wrong place to house asylum seekers and refugees from their point of view? And will you therefore join me in thanking the Home Secretary for announcing yesterday that the Wiltshire Hotel outside Rolwyn Bassett is in fact to be returned to its proper purpose in April?
Well, I thank my honourable friend for the question. He's absolutely right. The use of hotels is unfair, and also it's unfair on local communities and also costs taxpayers £8 million a day. And that's why our plans to reduce the number of people coming has meant that we could close the first 50 hotels across the country, with more to follow. And I thank the Home Secretary and his team for their efforts. But fundamentally, the only way to resolve this once and for all is to implement our Rwanda scheme so we can have a working deterrent, and that's how we will stop the boats.
Charlotte Littles.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I've been contacted by desperate constituents who have rung every single pharmacy within a 50-mile radius of Warrington and still haven't been able to access their medication for ADHD. This has been going on for months and isn't just a Warrington issue. Pharmacists are calling it the worst shortage ever seen, with only 11% of people able to access their full dose this month. And ADHD UK have called the government's response pathetic. They're right, aren't they?
Yeah,
So I'm very sorry to hear about the situation in the Honourable Lady's constituency, but the Health Secretary obviously heard what she said and is in touch with the relevant drug bodies to make sure we can have the provision of ADHD medicine to all of those who need it.
Tom Hunt.
For around a decade, over 200 of my constituents in the Mill complex in Ipswich have been caught in the cruellest form of limbo. There's deep structural problems with the building and cladding problems. A few years ago, they got about £50 million out of court settlement to make a contribution towards the cladding cost. The freeholder, NAMA, the Irish financial entity set up after the Irish banking crisis, ran away with that money, putting my residents and my constituents back in square one with little to no hope. Will the Prime Minister talk to the Irish tea shop to raise this immoral case and also meet with me to discuss a way forward for my constituents, who I meet with every week?
Prime Minister.
Well, I'm very sorry to hear about my honourable friend's case, but I'll ensure that the government looks into the details and gets back to him in shortest order about how we can support him and his constituents.
Martin Doherty's close question.
Number 10, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, I have repeatedly expressed my commitment to joint working with the First Minister of Scotland to deliver for the people across the country.
Martin Doherty.
I'm grateful for that answer, Mr. Speaker. While there's rightfully been much attention paid to the Post Office Horizon scandal, there is another shocking example of government and private sector collusion that began under the last Labour administration and continued under the Tories. Mr. Speaker, almost 200,000 mortgage prisoners who borrowed with high street lenders such as Northern Rock have become trapped after the portfolio was sold off to foreign entities like Topaz Finance and Heliodor, who have been creaming off extortionate revisionary standard variable rates essentially since 2008, leaving even those who kept up with payments in danger of having their home repossessed. 200,000 aspirant homeowners have had their dream taken away from. So can the Prime Minister, instead of playing catch-up like he is doing with the Post Office scandal, meet with me and campaigners to discuss what more can be done for mortgage prisoners?
Mr. Speaker, I am familiar with the situation for mortgage prisoners, and something I worked on as Chancellor, and I know the Treasury and the current Chancellor have been engaging with campaign groups and others to find ways to resolve it. It's not an easy situation to fix overnight, but there are things that are being looked at as we speak.
Douglas Ross.
Mr. Speaker, yesterday the Scotch Whisky Association published a report looking at the economic impact of the sector, not just in Scotland but across the whole of the UK. Some of the highlights included that in 2022 they generated £7.1 billion in gross value added, £2.1 billion has been invested in capital projects between 2018 and 2022, and 41,000 jobs are supported by the sector in Scotland, including 1 in 9 in my Murray constituency. Does the Prime Minister agree that supporting the Scotch whisky industry in the forthcoming spring budget and beyond is a correct priority for this government?
Well, my honourable friend is a superb ambassador for Murray and for Scotch whisky, and he's right, it's a hugely successful export industry that supports tens of thousands of skilled jobs across Scotland. I won't obviously tread on the Chancellor's toes about future budgets, but I am proud of this government's track record in supporting the industry, having removed US tariffs on Scotch whisky, reduced tariffs and deals with countries like Morocco and Argentina, and also supporting the sector's interest in our FTAs with Australia, New Zealand, and most recently with CPTPP.
Peter Dowd.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister has been very keen to take credit for falling inflation in previous months. Will he now take responsibility for today's rise?
Mr. Speaker, inflation was over 11% when I got this job. Inflation today is 4%, Mr. Speaker. In common with the US, France, Germany, all countries have seen a mild tick-up in December. All countries have. But the crucial thing is that inflation has been more than halved, delivered ahead of schedule, and that is having an enormous benefit to families up and down the country. Benefit that would be reversed by his party's plan to saddle them with £28 billion of tax rises.
Mr. Speaker, I'm a keen parkrunner in Walsall, but I'm also part of the core team of volunteers that recently brought parkrun to Tamworth. So in the 20th anniversary year of parkrun, will the Prime Minister join me in encouraging other towns that don't yet have a parkrun to get one?
Prime Minister.
Well, it's great to hear that my honourable friend is an avid park runner, and I thank him for actually volunteering so that the people of Tamworth can enjoy one too. I completely agree with him. When I had more time, I was a regular at the North Allerton Park Run and the Junior Park Run as well, which I recommend for those with children. It is a fantastic and accessible way to get people moving, and I join him in encouraging everyone to get involved in his local area and beyond.
Daisy Cooper.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. At the last general election, residents in West Hertfordshire were promised a new hospital, but we are still waiting for the green light and having to put up with broken lifts and overly crowded treatment wards. In other parts of the country, there are entire hospital buildings that have had to be closed down, like the one in Stepping Hill in Stockport, because they are structurally unsafe. From broken promises on new hospitals to the backlog of repairs, people are sick and tired of waiting. So can the Prime Minister tell me, by the time of the next general election, how many of the broken hospitals will be fixed, and will my residents be able to point to a single spade in the ground?
Yeah. Well, Mr. Speaker, we're investing record sums to not just deliver 40 new hospitals across the country, but 90 different hospital upgrades. And she'll be familiar with the plans, I hope, at West Hertfordshire Trust to develop a new emergency and specialty care facility at Watford General, including women's and children's services. It will make an enormous difference to residents in the area.
Leave it.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. A recent BBC News article raised fears that Blyth could become a ghost town, as we see our shopping centre closed to be replaced by a new higher education facility. Residents are right to be concerned, and I have personally seen decades of Labour neglect and decline in our town. And I really have. But this Conservative government has invested hundreds of millions of pounds to level up my constituency with spades in the ground as I speak here in the House of Commons. Can my right honourable friend assure me that the rebirth of our towns will continue as a key focus of this Conservative government?
Well, my honourable friend is absolutely right, and I commend him for being such a strong advocate for Blyth. And nearly half of the recent Towns Fund has been distributed to northern regions in England to level up constituencies like his own. And that is the difference. As he said, after years, if not decades, of neglect under the party opposite, it's this government that is levelling up across our country.
Final question, Ian Mans.
I'm very grateful, Mr. Speaker. In June 2022, to some fanfare, the government announced the approval of £41 million for a package of works for the restoration of the Tyne Bridge, which is the route of the A167, the old A1, and it connects Gateshead with Newcastle city centre, and is instantly recognisable around the world as an emblem of Tyneside. However, the funding is still awaiting sign-off within the Department of Transport, and work cannot progress. So given the scale and the complexity of the work that's required, and the significant additional cost implications if funding doesn't come forward, can we actually have the money, please, to get on with the work so that the bridge will be ready for its centenary celebrations in 2028?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'll ensure that the relevant minister gets back to him with an update on the project, and I'm pleased not just investing in that project in his area, but also following on from the last question, I know his area has received levelling up funding worth £20 million to help transform the visitor economy in Gateshead. Yet more example of this government investing to level up across the north and across the country.
That completes Prime Minister's questions. Point of order, Dame Diana Johnson.
Mr Speaker. Further to the question asked by the Honourable Member for Glasgow South West and the announcement this morning by Sir Brian Langstaff about the report on the infected blood inquiry now being scheduled for publication in May, the Honourable Member also raised that Sir Brian said very clearly in his comments this morning, my principal recommendation remains that a compensation scheme should be set up with urgency, and he made that recommendation in April 2023. The Prime Minister did not respond to what Sir Brian has said this morning, and I wondered whether, Mr Speaker, you'd had any indication there'll be a statement from the Cabinet Office to set out what they are going to do about complying with the recommendations made by Sir Brian.
Can I just first of all say this is a very important issue, and I do know that the Honourable Lady has certainly campaigned all the way through to ensure that people are recognise the suffering they've had and the tragedies within those families. What I would say is I'm not responsible for the Prime Minister's answer, and I would say is I've been given no notice that a statement is coming. But what I do know, and I can be rest assured, that the Honourable Lady will not stop at the question she's just asked, but she will pursue it through other avenues to ensure that the question she asked is answered somewhere. Right, we now come to presentation of bills. Tim Farron.
Outdoor Education Bill.
Second reading what day?
Friday, 21st of June, sir.
Friday the 21st of June. Okay, Tim, thank you. Right, we come to the 10-minute rule motion. I call Caroline Lucas.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. I beg to move that leave be given to bring in a bill to establish the right to breathe clean air, to require the Secretary of State to achieve and maintain clean air in England, to involve the UK Health Security Agency in setting and reviewing pollutants and their limits, to enhance the powers, duties and functions of various agencies and authorities in relation to air pollution, to establish the Citizens' Commission for Clean Air with powers to institute or intervene in legal proceedings, and to require the Secretary of State and the relevant national authorities to apply environmental principles in carrying out their duties under this Act and the Clean Air enactments, and for connected purposes. Madam Deputy Speaker, in 2013, the life of 9-year-old Ella Roberta Adukisi-Deborah was tragically cut short when she suffered a fatal asthma attack. Ella lived close to the heavily congested South Circular in Lewisham, and following an inquest in 2020, she became the first person to have air pollution listed on her death certificate, with the coroner, Philip Barlow, concluding that, and I quote, Ella died of asthma contributed to by exposure to excessive air pollution. Next week would have been Ella's 20th birthday, and I know that all of our thoughts will be with her family at this time. I'd also like to pay tribute to Ella's mum, Rosamond, who's in the public gallery today, for her incredible campaigning on air pollution, and to express my personal thanks to her for allowing this bill to be called Ella's Law in memory of her daughter. It's an honour to be able to present it in the House today. Madam Deputy Speaker, this bill is needed because, simply put, the state of our filthy air is a public health emergency. Air pollution is associated with conditions like asthma, heart disease and cancer, and has been shown to impact our mental health too, leading to an increased risk of schizophrenia, depression and anxiety. Its impacts aren't equally felt, however, with those on low incomes and from black and ethnic minority backgrounds far more likely to live in polluted areas. And it's children's health that's affected most of all, with a study published just last week by the University of Dundee revealing an increase in under-16s admitted to hospital for respiratory problems following periods of high air pollution. A 2019 study by King's College London also showed that living within 50 metres of a busy road can stunt children's lung growth by up to 14%. And for context, it's estimated that in London, 1/3 of the population, around 3 million people, live near to a busy road. It is therefore profoundly shocking, but perhaps not entirely surprising, that the UK has one of the highest rates of asthmatic children across Europe, with 1 in 11 young people living with asthma. It's been calculated that cleaner air could prevent up to 43,000 avoidable deaths in the UK each year, and it could save the public purse billions as well. Estimates of the public cost of air pollution total as much as £20 billion each year, including the impact on social care and on our crumbling NHS. So it could not be more urgent that the government takes action to clean up our air and protects lives both now and in the future. Yet despite their current approach being vastly insufficient, ministers remain bullish in defending their efforts. Indeed, last year the Prime Minister himself told me, and I quote, "We are confident that the measures we're putting in place are not only legally binding, but world-leading in tackling air quality." And he went on to say that the Environment Act provides, and I quote again, "the capability, accountability and ambition needed to make all the effective interventions to drive down air pollution." And yet the reality is that the Environment Act did very little to help deliver clean air, and it is certainly not world-leading. And the environment target that did get made under it to reduce levels of PM2.5 to 10 micrograms per cubic metre falls short of the new WHO guidelines for 5 micrograms per cubic metre, and it could certainly be achieved far earlier than the government's target date of 2040. Indeed, when Professor Frank Kelly from Imperial College London, an advisor to the World Health Organization on health and pollution, recently gave evidence to the Environmental Audit Committee, he said very clearly that, and I quote, "Our studies show that 99.8% of the UK could achieve a figure of 10 micrograms per cubic metre by 2030, and the 0.2% that could not was certain hotspots in London, which again, if you took extra measures, you could probably eliminate as well." Professor Sir Stephen Holgate from the University of Southampton and Special Advisor on Air Quality to the Royal College of Physicians subsequently wrote to the committee to confirm that this change would result in around 20 fewer infant deaths each year. 20 fewer lives lost, 20 families saved from unimaginable heartache. And so with the Mayor of London having already committed to delivering on this more ambitious target, and with such significant benefits, it is incumbent on ministers to explain why the current legal limit remains so unambitious. And they must urgently set out how they're going to meet the new WHO guidelines, which have halved the limit for PM2.5 to 5 micrograms per cubic metre in response to the marked increase in evidence showing how air pollution affects current different aspects of our health. In the words of the Chief Medical Officer, Professor Chris Whitty, we can and should go further, and it is technically possible to do so. So the Clean Air Human Rights Bill, or Ella's Law, would set out an entirely new approach to delivering clean air in England. First, it would enshrine the human right to clean air precisely and explicitly in English law, thereby transforming decision-making by public authorities by requiring them to consider clean air alongside other rights under the Human Rights Act. It will be a step towards incorporating the 2022 resolution adopted by the UN General Assembly, which recognises the human right to a clean, healthy and sustainable environment. It follows a one air approach that encompasses the health and environmental impacts of air pollution and greenhouse gases. And it would set standards based on advice from the Climate Change Committee and on the WHO's new air quality guidelines, and require the Secretary of State to achieve clean air within 5 years, with the possibility of postponement for up to a further 5 years per pollutant, subject to strict conditions. Now, the Environment Agency and the Climate Change Committee would be required to review the pollutants and the limits annually and advise the Secretary of State if they need tightening. The bill also covers air pollution both outdoors and indoors in public spaces and where health and safety standards apply. The tragic death of 2-year-old Awab Ishaq, brought on by extensive mould in his family's flat, shone a spotlight on the significance of indoor air pollution. And whilst I welcome the prompt action which was taken by the Secretary of State for levelling up in bringing forward Awab's law, a law which should now, frankly, also be applied to the private rented sector through the Renters Reform Bill, it is very clear that legislation to address indoor air pollution must extend beyond the home too. Especially since, on average, we spend around 80% of our lives indoors, whether for work or study or leisure. And finally, in order to ensure independent scrutiny and continuous improvement, this bill would establish a Citizens' Commission for Clean Air, which would review annually the Secretary of State's compliance with the provisions of the bill and advise the Secretary of State where improvement is needed. Now, this is a bill which has already undergone significant scrutiny in the other place, after my noble friend and Green Party peer, Baroness Jones of Moulscombe, topped the private members' bill ballot in the previous parliamentary session. It has already been extensively debated, amended and improved, and it received cross-party support, including from Lord Randall of Uxbridge, former Environment Advisor to the Right Honourable Member for Maidenhead when she was Prime Minister, and he said, and I quote, "We have waited too long for proper clean air legislation. I urge the Minister to back this and say that it is a golden opportunity to do something really wonderful. The government could take pride in being part of a world-beating bill." Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, I think he was absolutely right. By taking up Ella's Law, the government has a real opportunity to genuinely lead the world in tackling this pressing public health emergency, and I urge them to take it.
Hear, hear.
The question is that the honourable member have leave to bring in the bill. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. The contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Who will prepare and bring in the bill?
Barry Sherman, Leila Moran, Ian Byrne, Dan Carden, Munira Milson, and myself, Madam Deputy Speaker.
Caroline Lucas.
Clean Air Human Rights Bill.
Second reading what day?
Friday the 14th of June.
Friday the 14th of June. Thank you. The clerk will now proceed to read the orders of the day.
Safety of Rwanda Asylum and Immigration Bill Committee.
No. Order. Sergeant. Order.
Safety of Rwanda Asylum and Immigration Bill.
I remind members that in committee, members should not address the Chair as Deputy Speaker. Please use our names when addressing the Chair. Madam Chair, Chair, Madam Chairman or Mr Chairman are also acceptable. We begin with Amendment 11 to Clause 3, with which it will be convenient to consider other amendments to Clause 3. Clause 3 stand part, amendments to Clause 5, Clause 5 stand part, Clause 6 stand part, amendments to Clause 7, Clause 7 stand part, amendment to Clause 8, Clause 8 stand part, amendments to Clause 9, Clause 9 stand part, Clause 10 stand part, all remaining new clauses, amendments to Clause 1 and Clause 1 stand part as set out in the selection paper. I call Robert Jenrick to move Amendment 11.